Here's something nobody actually says out loud. The vast majority of Americans have no real idea whether they're ahead or behind financially for their age. Not a rough idea, no idea. They look at their bank account, they feel okay or not okay, and they move on. And that gap between feeling and knowing is exactly where most people quietly fall behind. Today, we are fixing that. We are going through the real numbers, what the typical American actually has in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, and their 60s, using the most current data available from Empower, one of the largest financial platforms in the country, updated as of January 2026. And beyond showing you where people are, I am going to tell you where you should actually be heading and which moves matter most at each stage to get there. I'll leave timestamps in the description so you can jump straight to your decade, but I'd encourage you to watch the whole thing because what happens in each decade is directly connected to the one before it. One quick thing before we dive in. Net worth is just a simple calculation. Everything you own minus everything you owe. Your savings, your home value, your car, your retirement accounts, that's the own side. Your mortgage, your credit card balances, your student loans, that's the owe side. Subtract one from the other, and that's your number. I'm Matt. On this channel, I break down money decisions in plain English so you can actually use the information. If that sounds useful, hit subscribe. Now, let's get into the numbers. Let's start with a decade where everything either begins or gets skipped. According to Empower's data from January 2026, the median net worth for people in their 20s is $6,689. The average is $139,243. That gap is enormous, and it matters. The average gets pulled up by a small number of people who already have significant wealth. The median is the honest number. It tells you what the person right in the middle of the population actually has. And that person has $6,689. Now, here is what you need to understand about that number. It is not a disaster. Your 20s are the starting line, not the finish line. Most people in their 20s are dealing with student loans, entry-level salaries, and high rent. The fact that the median is positive at all is actually a decent sign. But what should you be working toward? According to T. Rowe Price, one of the most respected investment firms in the United States, a solid benchmark is to have roughly half your annual salary saved by the time you turn 30. If you're earning around $52,000, which is close to where most 30-year-olds land, that means having about $26,000 set aside. That's the target. Why does that number matter so much? Because money you put away in your 20s does something money saved later simply cannot. It has decades to grow. A dollar you invest at 25 can grow into $7 or $8 by your mid-60s, assuming average market returns. A dollar you put away at 45? Maybe $2. That difference is created entirely by time, not by being smarter, not by picking better investments, just by starting earlier. So what actually moves the needle in your 20s? 3 things, and the first one is going to sound counterintuitive. The most important financial asset you can build in your 20s is not a savings account. It is a savings habit. A 22-year-old putting away $200 a month consistently will almost always end up wealthier than a 28-year-old who waits until they can afford to save the right amount. The habit is the asset. The amount catches up later, which brings us to the first actual move, getting away from high-cost debt as fast as possible. I'm talking about credit card balances carrying interest rates above 10%, buy now, pay later balances that sneak up on you, personal loans that felt manageable when you took them out. This type of debt is actively working against your net worth every single day it exists. Student loans at a low rate are a different conversation. You can manage those over time, but anything charging you 15, 20, 25% in interest, that is priority number 1. The second is making saving automatic, even when the amounts feel almost embarrassingly small. If you can put 10 to 15% of your income somewhere it can grow before you ever see it, you are already ahead of most people your age. Fidelity's Q3 2025 data showed that the average 401k balance for people in their 20s has grown meaningfully over the last 2 years, which means more people are actually doing this. You want to be in that group. The third thing, and this one gets underestimated constantly, is putting real energy into growing what you earn. Your net worth grows 2 ways. You save more or you make more. In your 20s, you have time to chase both. Learning a skill that is actually in demand right now, picking up a certification that bumps your salary, building something small on the side. All of these compound over time the same way money does. Here's a question worth sitting with before we move on. What does your actual savings rate look like right now? Not what you intend to save, what actually leaves your account every single month headed somewhere that isn't a bill. Because the answer to that question, more than your salary, more than your job title, more than any investing strategy, is what determines where you start your 30s. And where you start your 30s matters more than most people realize, because that next decade, it is the one where the real gap between people who build wealth and people who don't starts to open up. Your 30s tend to be a decade that sneaks up on people financially. On paper, things look better. You're probably earning more than you were 5 years ago. Maybe you bought a home or you're thinking about it. Maybe you have kids or a partner or both. Life has gotten bigger. The problem is, spending tends to grow right alongside all of that, and that is exactly where a lot of people get stuck. Empower's January 2026 data shows the median net worth in your 30s at $24,508. The average sits at $325,952, again being pulled way up by people at the very top. The honest benchmark for most people in their 30s, $24,000 to $25,000 in net worth. Here is where it gets uncomfortable. T. Rowe Price recommends that by the time you reach the end of your 30s, so around age 39 or 40, you should have roughly 1.5 times your annual salary saved for retirement. At the median income for that age group, which runs around $62,000, that means having somewhere between $90,000 and $95,000 set aside. Looking at where the median American actually is, there is a real gap there, a big one. Pause for a second and think about this. The people around you who are visibly upgrading their lifestyle in their 30s, the nicer car, the bigger house, the frequent trips, are not necessarily ahead of you financially. In a lot of cases, they are actually funding your future, because every dollar they are spending to keep up is a dollar that is not compounding, and every dollar you are quietly saving instead is one that is. The gap between two people with the same income, same neighborhood, and same salary in their 30s can be $1 million by retirement. The only difference is what they chose to do with what was left over each month. So what actually matters most in your 30s? Number 1 is killing every debt that is not your mortgage. Your 30s are typically your first real window of meaningful earning power, and the worst thing you can do with that power is hand a chunk of it every month to a credit card company or a car loan. Every dollar going toward high-interest debt is a dollar that is not growing for your future. The mortgage stays. Paying that off is a goal for later. Everything else needs a payoff plan. Number 2 is something that sounds simple but costs people enormously: keeping your spending flat even when your income goes up. There is a very natural, very human tendency to upgrade your life as you make more money. Nicer car, bigger apartment, more subscriptions, more vacations. None of those things are wrong on their own. But if your spending rises just as fast as your income, your net worth barely moves. The people who build real wealth in their 30s are often the ones who keep living like they did in their late 20s, even as their paychecks grow. Number 3 is building an emergency fund that can actually handle your real life. In your 30s, the unexpected gets expensive. A medical issue, a broken furnace, a period without income. These hit differently when you have a mortgage and dependents. 3 to 6 months of real living expenses in a high-yield savings account is not optional at this stage. It is the thing that keeps one bad month from derailing years of progress. We are now about halfway through this video, and if you are watching and starting to feel a little behind, that is not a bad feeling to have. That discomfort is what gets people to act. Research consistently shows that people who actually benchmark their net worth are far more likely to hit their goals than people who avoid the numbers. The fact that you are here, looking at this honestly, already puts you ahead of most people who never do. What comes next is where things get genuinely high stakes, because in your 40s, 2 things happen at the same time. Income peaks for most people, and financial mistakes become a lot harder to undo. If your 30s are where the gap between people opens up, your 40s are where that gap either gets fixed or becomes permanent. Empower's most recent data puts the median net worth for people in their 40s at $76,479. The average is $750,578, the biggest average to median gap we have seen so far in any decade, which tells you that the ultra-wealthy are pulling that number up hard. The person in the middle of the 40s population has $76,000 in net worth. That is the reality for most people. T. Rowe Price's guidelines suggest that by age 50, you should have roughly 3 to 4 times your annual salary saved for retirement. At the median income for late 40s Americans, which sits around $65,000, that puts the target somewhere between $195,000 and $260,000. Look at where the median actually is. That is a gap worth taking seriously right now. Here is what makes the 40s genuinely dangerous. It is not that people stop caring about money, it is that everything starts feeling fine. Income is the highest it has ever been, the house is worth more than you paid for it, the retirement account has a real number in it now, and that feeling of fine is exactly what causes people to coast through the decade that matters most. Feeling fine in your 40s and being on track in your 40s are two completely different things. The data shows it, which is why the 3 goals for this decade are not optional. What percentage of Americans in their 40s do you think have less than $100,000 saved for retirement? Based on Fidelity's Q3 2025 research, that number is higher than most people sitting in their 40s would guess, and the reason almost always traces back to the same pattern. Income grew, lifestyle grew to match it, and the future got deprioritized. So what should your 40s actually look like? The first priority is getting serious about your 2 or 3 biggest financial targets and building a real plan around each one. Maybe that is paying off your mortgage by a specific age. Maybe it's fully funding your kids' education. Maybe it's simply maxing out every retirement account available to you. Pick your priorities, run the actual math. Vague intentions do not build wealth. Specific plans do. The second thing your 40s demand is a clear picture of what retirement actually costs in your specific life. What does your household spend right now? What disappears when you stop working? The mortgage, commuting, work costs, and the retirement savings themselves. Most people who actually run this math find their retirement number is more reachable than the headlines suggest. And the third thing, one that most people in their 40s still put off, is getting a basic plan in place for what happens to what you own if something happens to you. If you have a partner, kids, or a home, you need the basic legal documents that say what you want. It does not require a fortune or a lawyer. It requires making the decisions and putting them on paper. It's one of those things that feels irrelevant right up until the moment it urgently is not. Your 40s are the last decade where you have both meaningful earning power and enough time to make major corrections. The decisions you make or avoid here are going to define whether your 50s feel like a runway to retirement or a race against the clock. And for a lot of people, the 50s arrive with a realization that stops them cold, because the math that felt abstract in your 40s suddenly has a deadline attached to it. Most people hit their 50s believing the window for real financial change has mostly closed. That is one of the most expensive misconceptions in personal finance. Your 50s are actually the decade where the government specifically rewrote the rules to give you more options, not less, and most people never use them. Empower's January 2026 data puts the median net worth for Americans in their 50s at $180,227. The average, $1,364,050. That is the widest gap of any decade we have covered today. The typical person in their 50s has $180,000. The average is being dragged up by a relatively small group at the very top. Know which number actually represents your situation. T. Rowe Price recommends that by age 60, you should have between 6 and 7 times your annual salary set aside for retirement. At the median income for people in their late 50s, around $62,000, that means the target is somewhere between $372,000 and $434,000. If you are staring at that number right now and feeling a gap, you are not alone. But here's the thing about your 50s that changes everything. You almost certainly have more tools available to you right now than you did in any previous decade. In 2026, if you were 50 or older, your workplace retirement plan limit jumps from $24,500 to $32,500 per year. That's an extra $8,000 every single year going in tax advantaged. Your individual retirement account gets a bump too, from $7,500 up to $8,600 annually. These catch-up contributions exist because Congress recognized that a lot of people arrive at 50 with a gap, and they built a legal way to close it faster. Are you using them? Write that down. If you're 50 or older and not maxing out those catch-up contributions, that is the single highest impact financial move available to you right now. The second thing your 50s require is calculating what retirement actually looks like for your specific life, not a generic version, yours. What do you spend each month today? Which of those expenses disappear when you stop working? Commuting, work clothes, and the 15 to 20% of income you are no longer saving because that was the whole point. For most people who do this math honestly, retirement costs less than they feared. The third piece of your 50s is getting serious about when you plan to take Social Security, because that timing decision alone can change your lifetime income by hundreds of thousands of dollars. Taking it at 62 versus waiting until 67 or 70 creates dramatically different monthly payments for the rest of your life. Most people make this call without ever running the numbers. Here's the question that separates people in their 50s who arrive at retirement feeling confident from the ones who feel anxious. Do you have a specific number, not an estimate, not a guess, but a real calculation for what you actually need? Because if you do not have that number clearly in front of you, you are flying blind, and your 60s are not the time to figure it out. Speaking of your 60s, this is where the scoreboard finally gets revealed. Everything you did in your 30s, your 40s, your 50s shows up at once. And for some people, what they see surprises them in the best possible way. For others, it's a wake-up call they wish had come 10 years earlier. Either way, there are three things that determine which group you end up in. Your 60s are the decade that either feels like a reward or a reckoning. Empower's January 2026 numbers put the median net worth for Americans in their 60s at $290,920. The average is $1,577,907, the highest of any decade, and again, pulled significantly upward by the wealthiest households. The typical person entering retirement has just over $290,000 in total net worth. For many people, a large portion of that is home equity, not liquid retirement savings. T. Rowe Price's guidance for this stage is having 8 to 10 times your annual salary saved by the time you are ready to stop working. At the median income for Americans in their late 60s, around $63,000, that puts the target somewhere between $500,000 and $630,000. And if you look at where the median actually lands, there is a substantial gap there for most Americans. Here is the counterintuitive thing about that gap. The people who close their 60s feeling genuinely financially secure are not always the ones who accumulated the most. They are the ones who got specific about what they actually needed and stopped measuring themselves against a number they saw in a headline. A household spending $4,000 a month in retirement needs a completely different nest egg than one spending $7,000. Neither is wrong, but confusing your number with someone else's is how people either retire too late or run out of money too early. The most important thing in your 60s, bar none, is moving from guessing to knowing. What is your actual target number? What do you currently have? What is the gap, and what needs to happen between now and when you plan to stop working? Vague optimism does not retire you. A plan does. Stop for a second. If you had to write down your exact retirement savings target right now, not a rough guess, the actual number you are aiming for, could you do it? If the honest answer is no, that is the most important thing to fix in the next 30 days. Not a new investment, not a refinancing, just knowing the number. The second focus of your 60s is protecting what you have built. Early in your working life, you could afford to ride out a down market because time was on your side. In your 60s, that buffer shrinks, gradually shifting toward less volatile assets while keeping enough growth to outpace inflation is not pessimism. It is what protecting decades of work actually looks like. And the third piece of your 60s is getting to a paid-off home if at all possible. If you bought in your 30s on a 30-year mortgage, that clock is nearly up. Entering retirement without a monthly mortgage payment changes what your savings need to do for you and creates breathing room that compounds through every year of retirement that follows. Here's the thing about all of this. The gap between where the average American ends up and where you can end up is not created by luck or income alone. It is created by a handful of decisions made consistently over time. Higher savings rates, avoided high-cost debt, income that grew because skills grew, a plan that was actually written down. The people who hit their 60s feeling financially solid almost always made those decisions earlier than everyone around them. Not perfectly, not without setbacks, just earlier and